is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. And in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the quotes today that came out of the John Mara press conference. Not a lot of new things here. Did give a different perspective, at least a little bit, on the Saquon Barkley situation. Also talk about what he had to say about the expectations of this team going forward. He did touch on Daniel Jones, and he did touch on Joe Judge. I'll start with the quote about Daniel Jones. When asked about whether or not there was a benchmark for Daniel Jones, he went on to say just this: "We think the world of Daniel Jones in this building. I don't have any benchmarks other than let's win some more games. I think he will have a better team around him than past years. I think he has what it takes to be a long-term winner in this league." When asked about Golladay, he said part of it was based on accelerating the process for Jones. Surrounding Daniel with more weapons was a priority this offseason, which is self-explanatory. I think we all knew that going into the year, and they still may look to do that. Now, when asked about signing Kenny Golladay, and when asked about signing Adoree Jackson, he didn't really specify in the cornerback position, but he did say it made it so that they did not have to draft a wide receiver in the first or second round. Take that for what you will. That does not mean that they won't if they feel like it is the best player available. So we'll have to wait and see what happens in the first or second round of this year's draft. I'm still leaning that they will not, but if they're blown away by a wide receiver that is there, they absolutely could take one if they feel like it will help Daniel Jones more so than taking an offensive lineman at that point in time, if they feel like they could get more value later in the draft. And we're just going to have to wait and see another month away how that draft will, transpire. When asked about Joe Judge, a lot of the same. I mean, he talked about how good the locker room culture has been since he's been here, how it's night and day since Pat Shurmur's been the head coach, which should not be a surprise to anybody else. It did really make me feel confident that Joe Judge is going to be here for a long time. When John Mara talked about Joe Judge, he spoke very confidently about the way that he handled free agency. He said he was incredibly prepared. He did a ton of background research on these players, specifically Kenny Golladay and Adoree Jackson, before they even entered the building. Talked to former coaches, talked to former players, so on and so forth. So what we expect now of Joe Judge. The guy's very prepared. The guy's very smart. When asked about playoff expectations, and I'm going to give my opinion on this as well, he said that he expects the playoffs every year. Now, to be fair, I think, reasonably speaking, last year in the back of his head, he probably said I wanted to see progress, not so much playoffs. This year, at least in my opinion, the kid gloves come off. I am not going to be so, positive with losses this year. Based on what the New York Giants did this offseason, how aggressive they were, the money that they spent, yes, in my opinion, heads should roll if the New York Giants do not accelerate this process off of what they did in free agency. Now, I'm not telling you they should win a Super Bowl. Mara went on to say that they still have a lot of work to do, that this is not a finished product. Of course, we still have the draft. We have another offseason in the future. And that's the right thing for him to say. He doesn't need to put added pressure on guys like Daniel Jones and Joe Judge and Dave Gettleman and everybody else. But I'm telling you my expectations as a fan. Being that you went out there and spent all the money that you did on Golladay, being that you spent all the money that you did on Adoree Jackson, and you're no longer, in my opinion, in let's wait and see mode, even though I still think they're in rebuild, but this year, as a fan, obviously health is a factor. But if the team stays relatively healthy, I expect this New York Giants team to make the playoffs. I just do. I absolutely do. And if they don't, it would be a major letdown. I'm not saying that they got to win 12 games, but in the weak NFCs that they play in, being that you went out there and you addressed your two primary concerns, which was the wide receiver and the cornerback position, and if what you say about Daniel Jones is true, that you feel like he is going to be a franchise quarterback, a long-time winner, well, the guy's not won any games yet against significant opponents. He does not have a win in his career against a team over 500. And I'm not saying he will not improve. I think he will with some of the moves that we made. But if there is not significant progress this year and the New York Giants do not win at least 9 or 10 games, I think the fan base has every right to be upset. And that is my expectation going into the year. I've been very patient with this team. I'm going to continue to be very patient with this team. I'm not going to set Super Bowl expectations, but I am going to expect, at a bare minimum, strong playoff consideration going into Week 17 this year and at least 9 wins. And I think those are fair expectations based off the things that have happened. We're playing a softer schedule. We have more experience as a team in these schemes, and we brought in some big-time players. Of course, there's still definitely some question marks with this team, and it starts with the offensive line. I'm going to continue to say that. I was surprised he was not asked about that. He was, however, asked about Kevin Zeitler and Dalvin Tomlinson, and he said that was one of the hardest decisions he's had to make as an owner over the last 5 or 6 years, letting those two players go. He has tremendous respect for both of them. When asked about whether, why they did not trade Dalvin Tomlinson in season if they knew that he wasn't coming back, he talked about how he thought that it would be perceived poorly in the locker room and how they were still in the race, in his opinion, to make the playoffs. And ultimately they were. Had the Philadelphia Eagles won the last game, the New York Giants would have been in the playoffs. And maybe at that point in time, they didn't know what was going to happen. You don't know if Leonard Williams is going to get hurt. You don't know if players are going to regress, so on and so forth. But at the end of the year, he talked about how losing Dalvin Tomlinson was definitely one of the harder things that he had to do as a general manager. But my perspective as a fan, I expect the playoffs from the New York Giants in 2021. At least 9 wins. In terms of the Saquon Barkley thing, which is probably the biggest headliner from the press conference, he was asked about Barkley. He said, would you like to get something done with Saquon contract-wise? And remember, Dave Gettleman was asked that same question about a week or two ago, whenever his press conference was. And Gettleman said he went as far to say that they wouldn't even commit to the 5th-year rookie extension based on, depending on what the medical reports would be. Mara didn't go that far, and Mara was not asked specifically about that. But when asked about Saquon Barkley, he said this: we're not in a hurry to extend him. We expect him to be as good as new. We're not in any hurry to do this at this point in time, particularly at this point in time. We want him to be a Giant for life. And he went on to talk about how much money they spend in this offseason and how they're not in a place to be talking contract extension. He has said that in the past, that he expects Saquon Barkley to be a Giant for life. Probably expected Dalvin Tomlinson to be a Giant for life as well. So you can't read too much into that. I'm going to continue to say that I expect on May 3rd, which is the deadline, the New York Giants will give the rookie extension to Saquon Barkley, but that does not mean that he will be a Giant long term. And I think that question still needs to be answered. It definitely didn't leave confidence, if you're a person that wants Saquon Barkley here long term, towards that. He could have easily said, we're going to wait and see, and yes, we want to try to get a contract extension done by year's end. He went on to say that based off the money that we spent, don't expect it anytime soon, which tells me it's put up or shut up time for Saquon Barkley. He's got to prove that he's healthy, and he's got to prove that he could elevate this team. But in terms of the playoff expectations, I think he answered it properly, but I'm telling you, yes, I expect playoffs. And if we miss the playoffs outside of crazy injuries, which is definitely a part of it, I think New York Giants fans have a right to be concerned about this team. We're now entering year 3 of the rebuild, and they went out there and they spent hundreds of millions of dollars to accelerate this process that could potentially affect the future. And he was also asked about that from Ralph Vacchiano. Vacchiano of SNY said, last time you spent like this was 2016. Didn't work out great long term. Why do you believe this is different this year? He said, my feeling whenever we go into a free agency period, and I tell our people this, I don't care how much money we spend, just make sure it's the right guys we're bringing into the building. They think they'll be able to manage the cap effect moving forward. And he also said that Golladay and Adoree Jackson are relatively young players and they feel like they could be here long term. Basically saying that he feels like they'll be good over the entirety of that contract. Opposite of guys like Janoris Jenkins, Snacks Harrison, and Olivier Vernon, who started to regress midway through those contracts. So that's what he also went on to say. But football is a game of unpredictability. You can't predict injuries. I think I'm going to continue to say it was the right time to do it, and I think it's completely different than the previous time when Eli Manning was already under a big-time contract, Daniel Jones under the rookie salary. But make no mistake about it, the Giants, when they did this, I do think it's playoffs or bust this year for this team, and I'm glad as a fan that it is. We finally have some reasonable expectations going into a season, and it's no longer a wait-and-see approach. We need to get this young team some playoff experience, and with Joe Judge at the helm, if a few things bounce our way in terms of health, I expect the New York Giants to be there. As always, guys, if you liked what you watched, please subscribe. Drop a comment. Maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.